Detective Elric Graves was accustomed to cases that defied reason, but the report from a remote village in Hokkaido chilled him to the bone, literally and figuratively. Over the span of 2 weeks, 70 people had been found dead in the snow, their bodies frozen solid despite mild winter temperatures. The victims' faces were twisted in terror, their hands raised as if trying to shield themselves from something unseen. No signs of struggle, no wounds, and no explanation. Local authorities were baffled. Rumors spread quickly among the remaining villagers of Yuki-Onna, the Snow Woman, a spectral figure from Japanese folklore said to appear during snowstorms to claim the lives of travelers and villagers alike. Graves, already in Tokyo for a separate case, was called in after officials admitted they were out of their depth. He boarded a train to Hokkaido, his iron dagger packed alongside his notebook. Snow fell softly outside the window, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the frost carried more than just a chill. The village of Yuki-Onna was nestled deep in the mountains, its small houses coated in a perpetual layer of frost. Graves arrived as the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the peaks, casting the snow-covered landscape in hues of blue and gray. A man named Hiroshi, the village head, met him at the station. Hiroshi's face was pale, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Thank you for coming, Detective Graves. We don't know what else to do." Graves nodded, stepping off the platform into the frigid air. "What can you tell me about the deaths?" Hiroshi glanced around, as if afraid the snow itself might hear him. "It started 2 weeks ago. First, it was travelers, people caught in snowstorms. Then, it was villagers, taken from their homes. Always the same, frozen solid, their faces, terrified." Graves adjusted his hat. "And the rumors of Yuki-Onna?" Hiroshi hesitated. "The elders say she's real. They warn us to stay inside during the storms. But this feels like a curse. No one is safe." Graves visited the site of the most recent death, a small clearing on the edge of the forest. The snow was untouched, pristine except for a single pair of footprints leading to the victim's body. The prints were small, delicate, like those of a barefoot woman. The body lay in the center of the clearing, frozen mid-motion. The victim, a young man, had one arm outstretched, as if reaching for help. His eyes were wide open, his lips blue. Graves crouched beside the body, studying the scene. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken branches, not even a hint of melted snow. It was as if the man had simply collapsed and turned to ice. "Did anyone see or hear anything?" Graves asked Hiroshi, who stood nearby. The headman shook his head. "Only the wind. It howls louder than usual during the storms." Graves frowned, his breath misting in the cold air. The wind might not be the only thing moving during those storms. That night, Graves stayed in a small guesthouse on the outskirts of the village. The air inside was warm, but the sense of unease among the villagers was palpable. They avoided eye contact, their voices hushed as if speaking too loudly might summon the Snow Woman herself. As Graves reviewed his notes by the fire, he overheard 2 women whispering nearby. "She was seen by the river," one said. "A white figure, floating in the storm." "Shoo," the other hissed. "Do not speak of her. You'll bring her here." Graves turned to them, his tone calm but firm. "Tell me what you know about Yuki-Onna." The women exchanged nervous glances before one spoke. "She appears during snowstorms, dressed in white, her hair long and black. Her eyes are cold, and her breath, it freezes your soul." The other nodded. "She hates warmth, despises life. But sometimes, she spares those who are pure of heart." Graves filed the information away, knowing that legends often carried fragments of truth. The following evening, a snowstorm swept through Yuki-Onna, its ferocity unmatched. Wind howled like a living thing, rattling windows and burying paths in fresh drifts of snow. Graves stayed awake, listening to the storm. He could feel something in the air, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his bones despite the fire blazing in the hearth. Around midnight, he heard it, a soft knock at the door. Graves rose slowly, his hand resting on the iron dagger at his side. He opened the door a crack, and his breath caught. A woman stood outside, her white kimono billowing in the wind. Her skin was pale as snow, her lips a deep, unnatural red. Long black hair framed her face, and her eyes glinted like ice. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice soft and haunting. Graves gripped the door tightly. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "A traveler lost in the storm." Graves didn't move. He had read enough to know that inviting such a figure inside could seal his fate. "Find shelter elsewhere," he said, his voice firm. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. The wind howled louder, and she vanished into the storm, leaving only a trail of frost on the doorstep. The next morning, Graves examined the frost left by the mysterious woman. The patterns were intricate, almost like frozen flower petals, and the temperature around the area remained unnaturally cold. "She came to you?" Hiroshi asked when Graves explained the encounter. Graves nodded. "If that was Yuki-Onna, she's not just haunting the village, she's testing it. Looking for weaknesses." Hiroshi looked uneasy. "What can we do to stop her?" Graves thought for a moment. "Legends say she spares some and takes others. We need to understand why she chooses her victims. There's always a pattern." Graves spent the day interviewing the families of the victims, searching for connections. Most of the victims were men, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s. Many were travelers or hunters, but a few were local villagers caught outside during the storms. One story stood out, a young man named Kenji, who had been found frozen near his family's shrine. His mother, an elderly woman named Akiko, described his final hours. "He came home after a hunt, chilled to the bone," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me he saw her in the forest, standing in the snow. She smiled at him, and he felt warm for a moment. Then cold, so very cold." Graves pressed her for more details, but Akiko could only weep. "He left her home, his mind racing. Yuki-Onna wasn't just killing indiscriminately, she was toying with her victims, offering them fleeting moments of warmth before freezing them to death." Detective Elric Graves pored over his notes late into the night, seeking connections between Yuki-Onna's victims. The pattern was faint but undeniable. Most of those taken had been men who had braved the storms despite warnings, their actions often driven by recklessness or pride. But there were exceptions. Some had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Why spare some and not others? Graves murmured to himself. Hiroshi, seated across from him with a cup of tea in hand, leaned forward. "The elders believe she tests people, sees into their hearts. If she finds something she doesn't like, she takes them." Graves frowned. "It's more than that. Spirits like her don't act without reason. She's tied to this place, to its sorrow. If we understand why she lingers, we can stop her." Hiroshi hesitated, then spoke quietly. "There is an old story about Yuki-Onna. Would you like to hear it?" Graves nodded. "Tell me everything." Hiroshi began the story, his voice low as if afraid the snow outside might be listening. "Long ago, this village was plagued by harsh winters. Crops failed, and people starved. One day, a woman appeared during a storm, a pale beauty dressed in white. She saved a traveler who had become lost, guiding him to shelter and warmth." Graves raised an eyebrow. "She saved him?" Hiroshi nodded. "But the man betrayed her kindness. When he reached the village, he told the elders of the strange woman. Fearing her power, they hunted her down, accusing her of witchcraft. She fled into the mountains, but the cold claimed her life." Hiroshi's voice trembled. "Her spirit returned as Yuki-Onna, vowing to bring the same cold and death to those who had wronged her. Since then, she has haunted these mountains, testing those she encounters. Graves sat back, his expression thoughtful. She was wronged, and now her vengeance has grown beyond control. If we can find her resting place, we might be able to release her. Hiroshi led Graves to the village's small shrine, nestled at the base of the mountains. The shrine's caretaker, an elderly monk named Eiji, greeted them with a wary look. "You wish to confront Yuki-Onna?" Eiji asked. Graves nodded. "We need to find where she died. If we can release her spirit, we might end this." Eiji frowned, his gaze drifting to the snow-covered peaks above. "The mountain is dangerous. Many have tried to climb it, but few return. It is said her body rests in a cave, hidden by eternal ice." Graves adjusted his coat, undeterred. "Then that's where we'll go." The next morning, Graves set out for the mountains, accompanied by Hiroshi and 2 other villagers willing to guide him. The ascent was treacherous, the snow deep and the winds relentless. As they climbed, the temperature dropped further, and the air grew thin. The forest thinned, replaced by jagged rocks coated in ice. "Look," one of the villagers called out, pointing to the ground. Graves knelt, brushing snow away to reveal a set of footprints, bare, delicate, and impossibly fresh. "She's close," he said grimly. The group pressed on, the footprints leading them to the entrance of a narrow cave. A cold wind emanated from within, carrying the faint scent of frost and something floral. "This is it," Hiroshi whispered. "This is where she rests." Inside the cave, the walls shimmered with frost, and the floor was slick with ice. The air was so cold it burned, each breath a struggle. At the center of the chamber lay a block of ice, perfectly smooth and clear. Encased within was the figure of a woman, her skin pale, her black hair flowing around her like ink. "Yuki-Onna," Graves murmured, approaching the ice. The air shifted, and a voice echoed through the chamber. "Why have you come here, hunter?" Graves turned to see the spectral form of Yuki-Onna standing at the entrance, her eyes like frozen stars. "To end the deaths," Graves said firmly. "To release you." Yuki-Onna tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You cannot release me. My sorrow is eternal, and so is my vengeance." Graves gripped the iron dagger at his side. "Maybe so. But it doesn't have to continue." Yuki-Onna floated closer, her presence suffocating. "You think yourself pure of heart, hunter? Let me see." Before Graves could react, she raised her hand, and the chamber dissolved into a blinding flurry of snow. When the storm cleared, he was no longer in the cave but in a vast, snowy field. "You will face your own heart," her voice echoed. "If you fail, you will join those who have fallen." Graves steadied himself, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Then let's begin." The snowy field shifted, forming a scene from Graves' past, a narrow alley in London, where a young boy had been killed during one of his earliest cases. The boy's face, pale and lifeless, stared up at him. Graves clenched his fists, his guilt resurfacing. "You failed him," Yuki-Onna's voice whispered. "How many others have suffered because of you?" Graves closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. "I carry those failures with me. They drive me to do better." The scene shattered like glass, replaced by the icy chamber once more. Yuki-Onna hovered before him, her expression unreadable. "You are not without regret," she said. "But your heart remains unbroken. We shall see if it lasts." Detective Elric Graves barely had time to catch his breath before the cave dissolved into another vision. This time, he was standing on a frozen lake, the ice beneath his feet cracking ominously with each step. The wind howled, and shadows danced on the surface of the ice. From the darkness emerged a figure, a towering creature of frost and rage, its body shaped like jagged shards of ice. Its eyes burned with pale blue light, and its roar reverberated through the frozen expanse. Your fear is as cold as this lake, Yuki-Onna's voice taunted, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. Face it, or be consumed by it. The creature lunged toward Graves, its massive claws tearing through the air. He dove to the side, rolling across the ice and gripping his iron dagger. Fear is natural, Graves shouted as he stood, his voice steady despite the chaos. But it doesn't rule me. The frost creature roared again, charging at him. Graves slid beneath its strike, plunging the iron dagger into its leg. The creature let out an agonized wail, shattering into a storm of icy fragments. The vision faded, leaving Graves back in the chamber. Yuki-Onna floated before him, her expression unchanged. You resist fear, she said, her voice cold. But fear is only the first trial. Now we see if your resolve can endure. The scene shifted again, and Graves found himself in a dimly lit room. He recognized it instantly, it was his childhood home. The faint smell of smoke hung in the air, and a woman's voice called out to him. Elric? Graves froze, his throat tightening. Turning slowly, he saw his mother standing by the fireplace, her kind eyes filled with sorrow. Why did you leave us? She asked, her voice trembling. Why did you let me die alone? Graves' chest ached. His mother had passed away years ago while he was on the other side of the world, chasing a case. It was a regret he carried every day, a wound that never fully healed. I couldn't save you, he said quietly. But I've spent my life trying to make it right, helping others the way I couldn't help you. The room darkened, his mother's form fading like smoke. Yuki-Onna's voice returned, sharp and icy. You carry your sorrow like a banner. But even banners can become burdens. Graves clenched his fists. Sorrow doesn't weaken me. It reminds me why I fight. The room dissolved, and he was back in the cave once more. Yuki-Onna studied Graves, her gaze piercing. You have faced regret, fear, and sorrow, and yet you stand. But do you truly understand me? Graves met her eyes. I know you were betrayed. Your kindness was met with cruelty, and your vengeance has festered ever since. But you don't have to remain in this cycle of pain. Yuki-Onna's form flickered, her cold facade cracking for a moment. I was abandoned, hunted like an animal. What justice is there for me? Graves stepped closer, his voice steady. Justice isn't always about vengeance. Sometimes, it's about letting go. Her eyes softened, but the storm around them intensified. You speak of letting go, but you hold on to your own pain. How can you ask that of me? Graves hesitated, her words cutting deeper than any blade. Because I know what it means to carry that weight. But I also know that clinging to it doesn't bring peace. The icy chamber began to crumble, cracks spreading through the walls and floor. Yuki-Onna's spectral form wavered as she clutched her chest, as if the act of confronting her own sorrow was tearing her apart. You think you understand me, she whispered, her voice trembling. But you know nothing of the cold. Graves stepped forward, holding out his hand. Then show me. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Yuki-Onna placed her icy hand in his. A surge of cold shot through Graves, and he was pulled into a vision of her past. He saw the village as it once was, alive with activity. He saw the young woman who would become Yuki-Onna, her smile warm despite the harsh winter. He saw the moment her kindness was repaid with betrayal, her body left to freeze in the mountains as the villagers watched from a safe distance. Her sorrow, her rage, her transformation, it was all laid bare before him. When the vision ended, Graves stood in the cave once more, his breath visible in the frigid air. You deserved better, he said quietly. Yuki-Onna's form flickered again, her icy exterior melting away to reveal a pale, mournful woman. Graves knelt before the block of ice that held Yuki-Onna's body, lighting a bundle of incense he had brought with him. The smoke curled upward, filling the chamber with a faint, earthy scent. I can't undo what was done to you, he said, his voice steady. But I can help you find peace. He began chanting a series of words he had learned from folklore, a prayer of release meant to sever a spirit's ties to the mortal world. Yuki-Onna watched him silently, her form growing fainter with each word. As the chant reached its crescendo, the block of ice cracked, and her body dissolved into a fine mist. The chamber grew warmer, the oppressive cold lifting. Yuki-Onna's spectral form smiled faintly, her eyes free of malice for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered before vanishing completely. When Graves and the villagers descended from the mountain, the storm had cleared. Yuki-Onna was bathed in sunlight, the snow glistening like diamonds. The villagers gathered around, their faces filled with hope. "Is it over?" Hiroshi asked. Graves nodded. "She's gone. Her spirit has been released." The villagers bowed deeply, their gratitude evident. They began to repair the shrine at the base of the mountain, leaving offerings of food and flowers to honor Yuki-Onna's memory. "She was a victim," Graves said quietly to Hiroshi. "Not a monster. Remember that." Hiroshi nodded solemnly. "We will." In the days following Yuki-Onna's release, Yuki-Onna began to rebuild. The villagers, once cloaked in fear, now walked the snowy paths with renewed purpose. Yet for Detective Elric Graves, the calm after the storm felt uneasy. He spent his final night in the village at the newly restored shrine. The offerings of food, flowers, and incense filled the air with a soft, warm scent, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had lingered before. Graves knelt before the shrine, his thoughts heavy. "Even with her gone, the scars remain," he muttered, staring into the flickering candlelight. 70 people dead. Entire families shattered. Hiroshi approached, carrying a small tray of tea. "Detective," he said gently, setting the tray down. "We cannot undo the past, but you've given us hope for the future." Graves accepted the tea, his expression softening. "It's not hope I worry about, Hiroshi. It's what fills the void she left behind." Hiroshi frowned. "What do you mean?" Graves glanced toward the mountains. "Nature abhors a vacuum. Spirits like her don't just appear, they're born from the sorrow and rage of the land. If the village forgets its lessons, another may rise in her place." The next morning, as Graves prepared to leave Yuki-Onna, an elder named Akiko approached him with a grim expression. "Detective," she said, her voice trembling. "Before you go, there is something you must know." Graves paused, adjusting his hat. "What is it?" Akiko hesitated, her hands clutching the hem of her robe. "When Yuki-Onna was alive, she had a child." The word struck Graves like a thunderclap. "A child?" Akiko nodded. "A daughter. The villagers, they took her away before Yuki-Onna fled to the mountains. No one knows what became of the girl, but some say her bloodline survived." Graves' mind raced. If the child's descendants were still alive, they might carry traces of Yuki-Onna's power, or her curse. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Akiko looked away. The villagers believed that speaking of the child would summon her wrath. "We thought burying the secret would protect us." Graves clenched his fists, suppressing his frustration. "Secrets like this never stay buried, Akiko. They only fester." Determined to uncover the truth, Graves postponed his departure and began questioning the villagers. Most were reluctant to speak, their fear of Yuki-Onna's legacy still strong. But after hours of persistence, he found a clue. An elderly woman named Reiko revealed that her grandmother had told stories of a child taken to another village far to the south, beyond the mountains. She was adopted by a family there, Reiko said. But no one knows what happened after that. The records, they're gone. Graves' brow furrowed. "And you think her descendants might still live?" Reiko hesitated. "It's possible. But if they do, they may not even know who they are." Graves thanked her, his resolve hardening. The release of Yuki-Onna's spirit had brought peace to Yukimura, but if her bloodline carried her sorrow and power, the curse might resurface elsewhere. The following day, Graves left Yukimura, his journey taking him south through snow-covered valleys and narrow mountain passes. He carried with him only the bare essentials, his iron dagger, his notebook, and the charm the villagers had given him as a token of protection. His destination was a village called Haruyama, the place Reiko had mentioned. The journey was grueling, the cold biting at his face and hands, but Graves pressed on. As he neared Haruyama, the weather began to change. The biting wind gave way to a strange, almost unnatural stillness. Snow still covered the ground, but the air felt warmer, heavier. Graves stopped at a small inn on the outskirts of the village, hoping to rest before continuing his search. The innkeeper, a wiry man with a weathered face, eyed him curiously. "You've come a long way," the innkeeper said, pouring Graves a cup of tea. "What brings you to Haruyama?" "I'm looking into a family," Graves replied, his tone careful. "A bloodline that might be tied to unusual events." The innkeeper's expression darkened. "You mean the frozen deaths?" Graves' eyes narrowed. "Frozen deaths." The innkeeper nodded, his voice dropping to a whisper. 3 men, found dead near the woods just last week. Their bodies, they looked like they'd been left in a blizzard. Graves stood at the edge of the woods where the bodies had been found, the iron dagger heavy in his hand. The snow was pristine, untouched except for faint footprints leading deeper into the forest. He followed the trail cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. The footprints were small and bare, reminiscent of the ones he had seen near Yuki-Onna's cave. The trail ended at a frozen pond, its surface glistening like glass. Standing in the center was a figure, a young woman dressed in white, her long black hair flowing in the wind. Graves called out to her, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Who are you?" The woman turned slowly, her face pale but serene. Her eyes were piercing, filled with an otherworldly sadness. "You know who I am," she said softly. Graves tightened his grip on the dagger. "Are you her descendant?" The woman's lips curved into a faint smile. "I am what remains of her sorrow. The bloodline carries more than life, detective. It carries memory." As the wind picked up, swirling snow around them, Graves realized that his work was far from over. Yuki-Onna's legacy had not ended, it had transformed. And now, it stood before him.